Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just going to give it a minute to let people join. Once everyone's in, then we'll get started. So just hold on for 1 sec. Once again, for those who joined in the last 30 seconds or so, we're just going to hold on for about a minute to let everyone join, and then we'll get started with the discussion. All right, let's wait another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll dive into it. Okay, I think we can get started now. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, everyone who's watching this live or watching this recorded. Welcome. This is the Tech and Society Salon. Today's episode is the state of home surveillance. So this Tech and Society Salon is hosted by the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and the Tech and Society Salon is a regular webinar series where we discuss a wide range of topics on surveillance, technology, and social justice. We bring together community organizers and experts in the field. We discuss how surveillance technology is impacting our communities and how we can fight back. The Surveillance Technology Oversight Project was founded in 2019. We advocate and litigate to abolish local government systems of mass surveillance. Our work highlights the discriminatory impact of surveillance on Muslim Americans, immigrants, the LGBTQ+ community, BIPOC individuals, and particularly the unique trauma of anti-Black policing. My name is David Siffert. I'm the legal director of STOP, and I'm going to introduce today's panelists. So first up, we have Nina Wang, who is a policy associate with the Center on Privacy and Technology, where she conducts research on government surveillance of immigrant communities, co-authoring American Dragnet, Data-Driven Deportation in the 21st Century. Before coming to Georgetown Law, she was a data scientist at Microsoft Data and AI, where she helped develop intelligent code completion tools for software developers. Nina earned her bachelor's degree in computer science from Princeton University, where she studied topics in artificial intelligence and public policy with the Center for Information Technology Policy. Her undergraduate research examined the legal and ethical frameworks shaping the governance of natural language technology. Jay Stanley is a senior policy analyst with the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where he researches, writes, and speaks about technology-related privacy and civil liberties issues and their future. He's the editor of ACLU's Free Future blog, and he's authored and co-authored a variety of influential ACLU reports on privacy and technology topics. Before joining the ACLU, he was an analyst at the technology research firm Forrester, served as American politics editor of Facts on Files World News Digest, and as National Newswire editor at MediaLink. He's a graduate of Williams College and holds an MA in American History from the University of Virginia. David Shalleck-Klein is the executive director and founder of the Family Justice Law Center, a member project of the Urban Justice Center Social Justice Accelerator Program, challenging illegal separation of families and the harms attendant to the cruel dismantling of families. David has been an attorney at the Bronx Defenders in the Family Defense and Criminal Defense Practices and clerk for the Honorable Tanya Chutkan of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, after graduating magna cum laude in Order of the Coif from New York University School of Law, my alma mater, and where I also work. At NYU, David was a member of the Family Defense and Juvenile Defender Clinics and was the recipient of the Kristen Jarecki 98 Memorial Prize for Outstanding Work and Commitment in a Law Clinic. So in this session, we're going to talk to the panelists about residential surveillance and privacy violations encountered in your research, advocacy, and legal work. We're going to look at how law enforcement agencies invade privacy of the home, surveil neighborhoods of marginalized communities, exploit weak privacy infrastructure of home data collection, and target immigrant and BIPOC families. So to kick this off, let's try to concretize this a little bit. I just want to ask, especially Nina and Jay, what are the devices and practices that are enabling this kind of in-home surveillance?
I mean, I can kick it off. I think there are sort of four types of surveillance. There's direct surveillance by the police. There can be surveillance by companies. There can be surveillance by other people, like somebody, if your neighbor across the street puts a Ring camera up that's, that's recording your front door. And then there's self-surveillance, where you buy surveillance devices yourself. And of course, all of these can be accessed by law enforcement, even if that's not the intended end user, with many powers that law enforcement have. But some of the technologies involved here are Internet of Things devices, such as things you might have in your own house that have microphones and cameras and stream them to companies. Drones and aerial surveillance is something that we may see more of in the future as the FAA loosens the rules, the currently very tight rules for how to fly, how and where you can fly a drone. Pole cameras, in which the police literally just put a 24/7 video camera on a pole, often secretly and hidden, that focuses on a person's house without a warrant. Ring doorbells, other cameras in the home. And so these are some of the technologies that I think are among the biggest. And let me talk a little bit about pole cameras, since in some ways it's the most direct surveillance of the home. It's a video camera run by the police, pointing at the home. And there have been a variety of cases around the country challenging whether the police can do this without a warrant. And different courts have found different things, and we have filed a cert petition asking the Supreme Court to decide this question. There have been some courts that have said that basically it is a search under the Fourth Amendment, because such 24/7 surveillance reveals various privacies of your life that law enforcement could never have recorded and seen over 6-month period or what have you, without great expense. And in surveillance, one of the dynamics is always the question of new technologies making surveillance that could be done without the technologies, but was much more expensive, and the very expense of that imposes a natural limit. The police aren't going to spend the money that it takes to have 24/7 surveillance over 6 months at somebody's house, very often, if at all, whereas it's incredibly cheap to just pop up a camera. And so things that can be done very easily tend to be overused. The other view is that, you don't have any expectation of privacy in public, and the camera is just looking at your public front door that anybody walking by can see. And so too bad, so sad. And so this is a decision, this is a case that we're hoping the Supreme Court will take up, because it's a circuit split, because it's a fundamental issue. And it's a question of whether a previous case, Carpenter, which ruled that the authorities need a warrant to get your historical cell site location data from the phone companies, just because it reveals so much information about your life, whether that precedent extends to pole cameras. So that's just a little bit more in depth about one of the technologies that I talked about.
Before turning to Nina, I do want to follow up on that with one specific thing, because pole cameras is something that STOP has been very interested in and concerned about. And when we did our research, one angle that we thought about is that a lot of these pole cameras that are pointed at houses could potentially see through people's windows inside to the inside of the house if they don't have blinds up, if they have their windows open. Is that an angle that you've pursued in any of your cases as a way of attacking these pole cameras?
Yeah, that's an issue in the case that we're asking the Supreme Court to look at, which is called United States versus Moore-Bush. And in that case, the video that was taken could see somebody who was at a window in her house. And so it's very much an issue, in addition to who was coming and going from her house and the curtilage and the yard and so forth, and for months on end. And so, but it's not. I think there's enough of a privacy invasion, even if you can't see in the windows.
Because right, when we were looking into this, there is some precedent specifically on cameras that can zoom, that look at windows, and I think that a lot of these pole cameras can zoom. And And so that was the angle that we've been interested in exploring. So I'm very interested to see how this turns out. So I guess yeah.
I mean, the other thing that I've written about, which is that when you have a large amount of video, like basically 24-hour video for 6 months, this is not your grandfather's video camera. We have artificial intelligence and machine vision that can now sift through those large amounts of video and search for particular objects, particular people, particular situations, particular actions, because the video analytics technology is getting better and better, and that's only going to probably increase. And so, that when we think about like long-term video surveillance, we have to update our intuitions about how powerful that is.
Thanks so much. So next up, I'm going to turn to Nina and ask you, what are the technologies, what are the practices that are concerning you most right now with respect to home surveillance?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jay mentioned a couple of technologies that are used by law enforcement for surveillance, like cameras and things. But one of the things that we really focus on is that in our regular lives, we leave data trails everywhere. So it's not always required that you have a special technology to capture the information. So my research for the past couple of years is focused on how ICE, U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement can actually access information that people share with their utility providers. So this includes gas, water, electric, internet companies, all of the service providers that give people some of the most basic services that they need to live. So last year we released some findings that showed that ICE and other law enforcement agencies as well have purchased access to a database offered by Thomson Reuters called CLEAR. That is basically a person search database. So it scrapes information from all over, all different types of sources to find people's detailed identity and location information. And one of the sources that Thomson Reuters will look for this detailed information is people's utility records, because from their perspective, utilities are one of the things that pretty much everyone has. I think over 90% of American adults have some sort of utility bill. So if you're trying to make a product to find or allow law enforcement agents to track someone down, utilities are a really good place to search from that perspective. So this company amassed a ton of data. They ended up gathering utility records from over 218 million unique individuals in the United States, including about 75% of adults in the country. So this is obviously a massive database, and they sell it to different law enforcement agencies, one of them being ICE. And when we did our FOIA research, we found a very chilling email sent by an ICE investigator, basically saying like, "Happy Tuesday, I'm looking for somebody in my investigation case. I looked up their utility records and I didn't find anything, but I'm looking at all these other different sources." So this information is actively being used by law enforcement, and it doesn't require a warrant to access it. All you need is just a login to get into the database. And the tricky thing with data surveillance, as opposed to more technology-driven surveillance, is that data is being collected by private actors. So in this case, it was Thomson Reuters who bought the information from Equifax, the very notoriously awful custodian of people's private information. So because it's done so much by private data brokers and commercial companies, it's very hard to get any insight into what's happening, to expose this information to the public. But it's such a massive industry that it facilitates some pretty extensive surveillance. So our research was able to get some lawmakers to pressure the companies to actually tell Equifax to stop selling it. So as of now, I believe ICE or any other agency no longer has access to utility data through CLEAR. But of course, because it's so pervasive, it's very possible that this information could make its way to law enforcement in some other way. But on the whole, with the home surveillance theme, the utility tracking is such a dangerous method of surveillance for so many people, just because it's crucial to have these services in your home. And if you're afraid to obtain utility services, it's very difficult for you to live or to maintain stable housing or basic health services. So that's what we've been working on.
And just one quick comment on the commercial side. I think that one of the things that's going on with surveillance in the house is that there's a conflict between two big legal doctrines in the US. One is the sanctity of the home. A person's home is their castle, etc. Scalia, in this case Kylo, where the police were looking into a home with a thermal scanner, which the Supreme Court ruled was a search, said the Fourth Amendment draws a firm line at the entrance to the house. And for example, the court has ruled that dog sniffs for drugs are not a search if they do it in your car. They're not a search if you do it in public. Refuse to allow them near the home. So the home has always, in common law, has always been a very special area. But on the other hand, we have this thing called the third party doctrine, which says that if data is held in private hands, then the government doesn't need a warrant to collect it. And that might have made sense in the 17th century when all your records were, in your home, including your medical and financial records. But when they're all on, big company servers, it's a huge hole in privacy. And so if data is flowing out of your home to utilities or other third parties, doesn't have the constitutional protection that your home has. And so that's, in some ways, when it comes to Internet of Things and utility data, it's like the big conflict that is unresolved.
So I have a great follow-up on this as well. For Nina. First of all, before I get to that, I'd be remiss not to tell our attendees that STOP is involved in a lawsuit against Thomson Reuters for its CLEAR product in California, arguing that it's a unfair business practice, a violation of consumers' rights, and that's ongoing litigation right now. I should also add specifically on the utility data, something that happened in New York recently is the city council a year or two ago passed a bill requiring DEP to release detailed water records for all of the customers and make them available online for purchase. This was sort of a gimme to these third-party expediter industry that tries to make money off of people who owe money on their utility bills or potentially were wrongly billed. But as a result, the database has not gone up yet. But if anyone out there is interested in putting pressure on the city council to reverse course on this, it might be a useful time for that. But my follow-up sort of sits at the intersection of a lot of this. You just mentioned the third-party doctrine. Nina, you were talking about how all the state is being sold. There's also a third-party consent doctrine, which is related to the third-party doctrine. But the idea is basically if a private entity has rights to this data, they can sell it. And a lot of times, things that would be search under the Fourth Amendment can be simply purchased by law enforcement. I think this is what Jay and Nina, you were both talking about. U.S. Congress, there's a bill out there called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act. A lot of people have some problems with it. A lot of people really like it. I was wondering whether you, Nina, think that whether that specific bill or something like that bill might help solve these problems in some way.
I will admit that I'm not very familiar with the specific contents of that bill, but I will say that Senator Wyden, who was behind the bill, worked very extensively with us to pressure the utility companies to cut off their access to selling to Equifax and CLEAR. So if you have a more specific thing on that act, I can answer it more directly.
I guess just like maybe more generally, do you think that like statutory blockers to law enforcement purchasing data that the Fourth Amendment would prevent them from accessing is like a good way forward on the types of concerns you're concerned about? Is that like a good policy direction, do you think, or do you have like other policy directions in mind?
I certainly think it's a very good first step. The really tricky thing about data buying and selling is that it's very hard to keep track of where this information is going, who's buying it, who's selling it, because many times you have multiple middlemen, and there are very many different sources that a law enforcement agent could go to obtain this information. For example, law enforcement often has a whole host of various different databases, whether they are owned by the government or by private entities. So a law that tries to cut off access would have to be very specific in not just, trying to cut off access to commercial databases, but also making sure that that information isn't leaking in some other avenue, because the tentacles are just so widespread, it's very hard to cut them off directly. So a law would have to be very specific in its language to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we get into solutions or mitigating factors, I do want to turn to David and ask you, you've sort of been on the front lines of people being harmed by surveillance. I'm interested to hear, what people have been hearing about all these issues, like you can be surveilled by drones, you can be surveilled by police. Like, why should people care? Like, what are the harms you've been seeing?
Sure. So I'll start by saying, I think what was obvious from the introduction is that I come to this conversation from a place certainly not having expertise, but really having a lack of even basic knowledge about many of the surveillance tactics that law enforcement and other government agents are using on a day-to-day basis. And just sitting here listening to Jay and Nina and you list them off and sort of how normal that is really sends such fear and chilling aspect to my thinking. I mean, it's hard for me not to want to turn off my heat, shut my blinds, and log off of this computer right now. I'm hearing from these experts what exactly is going on, and of course that is a larger principle of the surveillance, in that Jay, of course, alluded to this, that there's the ancient adage that every single person's home is their castle, and in our constitutional order, there are certain things that are strongly protected by the Fourth Amendment. But when it comes to the Fourth Amendment, the home is first among equals, is the first among equals, because of what we want the home to be, the actions that we take in a place that we want not just privacy, but security, where we stretch the limits of our thinking, when we challenge some of our basic assumptions, when we are raising our children or having the most intimate moments with families and gatherings, that should be free from government intrusion and surveillance, except in the most limited of circumstances. I come to this work primarily from dealing with community members who are surveilled primarily because of their economic status, because they live in poverty. When you live in poverty in the city, you are reliant on so many different government agencies and agents who deploy such intrusive tactics and means to follow you, they use more benign terms such as supervise you instead of surveil you, and condition basic survival on the forfeiture of what would be really fundamental and basic constitutional rights. And in New York City, the Administration for Children's Services, ACS as it's commonly known, is the child welfare organization. And it's an agency that if you live in certain communities, you know very well and are scared of. And if you live in different zip codes, you have no idea what it is. Black children make up 23% of the city's population, but 56% of foster care. Roughly 90% of children in foster care are Black and brown. And when you look at the neighborhoods that have the highest percentage of foster care rates and the highest percentage of investigations, they are also the neighborhoods with the highest percentage of child poverty rates and highest percentage of Black residents. And there has recently been a national awakening in the last few years because of the family separation that was happening at the US-Mexico border. And a sense that we should not be surveilling and separating families unless it is absolutely necessary because of the grave harm that is done when government agents intrude upon and surveil and chill very basic child-parent relations. But what so many in New York City said was that family separation, unnecessary family separation and surveillance doesn't just happen at the US-Mexico border. It happens at the border of Harlem. It happens at the border of East New York. It happens at the border of Williamsbridge, Bronx, and it happens at the border of Jamaica, Queens. These investigations are not few and far between. ACS investigates over roughly 50,000 families every single year. And during these investigations, government agents come to the home, gain access to the home using highly coercive tactics, from threatening parents that if they are not allowed in, they will take their children and place them with strangers in foster care, threats that if they are not allowed in, they will come back with the police and force their way into homes, telling parents that they do not need to get court orders or warrants, and let me just call it what it is, lying to parents that they do not need to get court orders or warrants to enter homes, even though they are government agents and the Fourth Amendment clearly applies to them, and that statutorily they do, and constitutionally, they do need to get warrants supported by probable cause. And once they enter homes, these government agents open medicine cabinets and read labels. They peer under beds. They pull out drawers in bedrooms. They rifle through your belongings. They open up refrigerators. They demand that children get out of bed in the middle of the night and that they pull up their shirts and pull down their pants. And these government agents' observations and opinions are cataloged and memorialized in permanent government records. And these government agents and agencies, even though 90% of these investigations, 90% never come to court, never are brought to court. The government agencies' opinions has been, well, the opinion has been, well, no harm and no foul. And that could not be more wrong on both counts. There is a foul. It's a foul of constitutional magnitude because it is nothing short than government agents conducting a warrantless search of the most constitutionally protected place in the home, and not just one search, of course, but many upon many there. And there's enormous harm as well, because what happens is that these government agents' surveillance of these families instill enormous fear into parents, enormous fear into children that they will be taken from their parents and placed into foster care. It is humiliating to families. Parents feel like second-class citizens in their own homes. Children who are used to viewing their parents as authority figures see their mothers and fathers having to kowtow and be subservient to these scary strangers who enter the home. And this fear and this terror infiltrates and permeates hallways, housing complexes, entire communities. It's insidious and it's pernicious. And of course, it chills future behavior within the relationship where we want exploration and freedom and happiness. And this is just, of course, one way, as I've now learned from Nina and Jay, that these both explicit but also sometimes hidden surveillance really chills who we are individually, as families, collectively, and as entire communities.
That's a lot. So I guess, have you seen, can you tell a little bit more? Are there any tactics that ACS uses to surveil families besides from just physically coming in and looking around? Do they get access to information in any of the ways that Nina or Jay has been concerned about? Anything like that?
So for the most part, no. I mean, part of why they don't is because we are so far behind holding these government agents to the same scrutiny and standards that police officers are. ACS takes the position that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to them. That even though they're government agents, and even though courts across the country in New York have said that it does, that the Fourth Amendment simply is not directed at them, and they don't need to operate within its guidelines. So they don't need to use much of other technology because they can personally go in as a general matter. However, they do use highly coercive tactics to weaponize people's own technology against them. And I guess this would fit into what Jay was saying at the beginning in terms of self-surveillance in his sort of 4 buckets, meaning I don't want to come out to your home, but you need to turn on your camera. We're going to have a video chat, and you turn on your camera and you use that camera to show me the children, to show me every corner of the home. So because I, for whatever reason, don't want to come there. It started out as a COVID measure that they were resorting to, and now they have started using it. I can't give you an explanation why, other than potentially it saves some resources, but there is some of that. ACS does have, my understanding is various MOU or memorandums of understanding and different working groups or working relationships with the NYPD and prosecutor's office in terms of sharing information that they do obtain. And the most recent intrusion into homes through the child welfare system has been through the rise of remote learning. Of course, teachers in New York City or other educational officials are what are called mandated reporters, meaning that if they see what they suspect to be neglect, they are required to make a call against the family to what's known as the state central registry, which starts an investigation. Now, there is a whole conversation to be had with problems with mandatory reporting laws that we won't go there now. But what that does do is, through the video cameras that take a very obviously limited picture of what is going on into a home, there are so many more eyes now into a home that there has been concern and discussion about what will that lead to for certain families, and who can put together a good backdrop and who can't. But I have never, to be fair, I have never encountered a case in my family court practice when I was with the Bronx Defenders where there was, the use of surveillance of the home through the type of, video cameras on poles that or something like that we've been talking about here tonight.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up for each person, which is basically like, before we turn to Q&A, which is basically like, let's give some degree of hope here, because this is all very bleak. So I'm going to ask, is there anything that individuals can do to protect themselves from this kind of thing? And is there anything we can do as a policy matter that would change the system for the better? So either or both, preferably like maybe one of each, but at the very least one or the other recommendations from each of you in terms of what an individual can do and what we can do as a policy. And I'll go reverse around the horn. So why don't we go to David first on this one?
That feels unfair. I'll start with the system wide because I was sort of addressing some of the systematic and systemic problems in the system. I think there, thankfully, is now the start of real support for pushing back both through litigation and through legislation on some of the policies and practices that are perpetrated through the Administration for Children's Services. The main one legislatively is that there's a bill both in the state and the city council that's called the Miranda family, or the family, I can't remember what it's called, essentially the Miranda bill, which would require ACS to tell families what their rights are. It would not create any new rights. It would simply say at the beginning, start of investigations, you tell families that they have the right to speak to a lawyer, that they have the right not to allow agents into their home, and some others that are enumerated in there. Unfortunately, ACS came out against that legislation in the last term, and it didn't pass, but we are hoping that it does in the upcoming session. Not to self-promote too much, but on the litigation front, that's precisely why I started the Family Justice Law Center, which is to give families the same tool that other civil rights, every single other civil rights issue has, which is an organization, like the ACLU, that goes on offense and brings the types of class actions and other impact litigation to hold government officials accountable for violations connected to the child welfare system. On an individual scale, on an individual level, know that when there is a so-called child protective investigation, it's called different things in different states and different municipalities, but essentially a child welfare investigation, an ACS investigation, you have rights. And it's important to know those rights, and it's important to be able to make individualized decisions about what's right for you and right for your family. But simply starting from the place, knowing that these are government agents who wield an enormous amount of power, just empowering people with that knowledge is so important for pushing back.
Does that Miranda bill have a bill number that we can have people call their legislators about?
Sure. Let me find it, and if you circle back to me, I'll give it.
Sounds great. Nina, what about you? Do you have any way to give us some hope in the face of all this?
So I know you're looking for hope, but unfortunately, I'm going to give a little bit of bleakness first, which is that when it comes to utility surveillance in particular, it is very, very challenging to ask individuals to prevent their information from being shared with law enforcement, simply for the fact that everyone needs these basic services like water, electricity, certainly the internet in these days. And when we have seen instances of people not being able to get utilities for whatever reason, we often see that they need to rely on other solutions that are often very destabilizing. So, for example, if someone's afraid to sign up for electricity, they might decide to rent an apartment from a landlord where the landlord takes care of the electricity. But that creates an imbalance of power and a dependency that could be very harmful to a family. And in the very worst case, people might just decide not to go with utilities altogether, which is obviously a very bad solution for health and safety reasons. So on the individual scale, when it comes to this, I think that policy solutions are really the only way forward here. And I think that, as David, you mentioned, the Fourth Amendment is not for sale act seems like it's a first step in cutting off law enforcement access to commercial data broker services. There's also a very strong argument that maybe there needs to be protection for utility data specifically, in that this category of data collected from essential services should not be used against somebody. So just like in the way that we have protections for health data or for credit data or for census data, maybe this needs to also be a category protected unto itself. So that's what I would say for solutions to the surveillance.
I would say, I mean, look, privacy, there's things you can do, but at a basic level, privacy is a social decision. Like, you can't choose not to have a license plate in your car. If you sell or buy real estate, the records of those sales are public. There's certain things we choose, choices we make collectively, and it's very hard for an individual to overcome a lot of those choices. I think that's what Nina was talking about, how difficult that is in that context. But I mean, one area where you can have maybe the most effect is what I talked about, self-surveillance. I mean, people like surveillance because, you know, surveillance is power, and they don't like other people to have power over them. They like to have power, so they buy a camera, they install it, buy a Ring camera, what have you. They buy, smart speakers and smart homes. They say that like 1 in 3 American homes now qualify as a smart home. Cable TVs, cars, and all kinds of other everyday objects are incorporating, internet connections and sensors. And that's kind of a, you do that to empower yourself, but that power can be flipped against you, either by hackers, by the company itself, and certainly a lot of the companies that sell these things have been found to be, rummaging through their customers' data, often in order to improve the AI algorithms, or by hackers. So companies, or with the police, if they get a warrant, hackers, the police, the companies. And so, I think that you need to think very carefully about what kind of surveillance devices you install in your home, and what kind of devices that are connected to the internet. If you can get, for example, I wanted a LED light bulb that could show many different colors for my front porch. So it could be, orange on Halloween and different colors, and blink. And there were some that connected via Wi-Fi locally, and there are others that maybe register, and they were going to go through the cloud. And like, why does a device like that have to be sending data to the manufacturer? I understand the manufacturer wants it; it's worth money. But me as the consumer, if you shop a little carefully, you make very conscious decisions about what kinds of things to put in your home. It can ameliorate the problem. I mean, there are, if you have no idea that your smart television is recording things, which was a scandal a number of years ago, it's hard for you to be a technology. Not everybody can be a technology expert, or what have you. But so I think that's one thing you can do. But policy is where the most can be done. We need good, strong, overarching, basic privacy rules, and we need rules that govern specifically, law enforcement use of technologies, both in general, by continuing to fight for strong constitutional protections, make sure the Constitution continues to have meaning, and also technology-specific things like drones. What are the rules going to be around drones? Can any police officer, can they patrol over your house whenever they want to, for example? We're going to have to answer those questions in the future. That's going to have to be done at a policy level.
Thank you. So before we turn to Q&A, David, do we have a bill number?
Yes, thank you. It's in the Senate. It's Senate Bill S5484B. It's sponsored by Senator Brisport, and in the Assembly, it's Assembly Bill A6792A.
So you heard it here, S5484B A6792A, to require a Miranda-like warning issued by CPS so that people know that their rights. That's a thing that you all can advocate for. So why don't we turn it over to Q&A now? If you have a question, drop it into the Q&A box or drop it into the chat. Would love to get input from all of you. Not, I can keep asking questions all day, but I would love to hear from the attendees if you have any questions about any of this. All right. Well, hopefully. Oh, we got one in the Q&A box. Is there something that can be done related to setting the default technology, policy, and user experiences to something other than uncontrolled surveillance? And how do we make the surveillance risk transparent to people so they might have a decision about surveillance? So when it comes to, I guess, any of the technologies you're seeing in the home, is there like a policy way to recommend, maybe opt-in settings, and making a more clear choice about the opting in and opting out? Like, are there has anyone proposed rules like that? I know California has some vague privacy rules. In Europe, they have GDPR, which is not, I don't know how much that deals with, smart devices as opposed to, cookies on websites. But I don't know if any of you have been following any of that or have
I mean, I haven't been following it super closely. It's not my role, but I mean, certainly there are overarching privacy principles that are recognized around the world that people should have some choice and awareness of what kinds of and control of what kinds of data is being collected about them. And things like the GDPR, California's laws, and some of the other state laws we're seeing are attempts to put that into law to create stability of expectation so that some ground rules that everybody knows that reflect fair practices. And Congress has been looking and sort of flirting with creating similar kind of U.S. alternative, although it appears to be going nowhere right now. But it could. And that those rules can make a big difference. It's a very, very complex area, and exactly how the GDPR, like the areas in which GDPR works well, which it doesn't, are still sort of unfolding, and the same is true with California's law. But the key is to put in place strong laws that put in place that kind of baseline of expectation, so everybody can sort of have some faith that unless they give their explicit, knowledgeable permission for data to be used and a bar against it being collected for one purpose that you're told about and used for other purposes, that you can be confident that that's not happening. And that's, instead of that, we have a Wild West in the commercial privacy area. And so, yeah, that can definitely be done. It's been discussed, in the privacy world a lot. But there are strong commercial interests that don't want it, and there are, and a lot of sort of law enforcement above all other values, attitudes have slowed reform.
And as a little bit of follow-up, Nina, I wonder whether you or your center have done thinking about, opt-in, opt-out frameworks versus data minimization frameworks. Do you have thoughts on that? I don't know. I'm interested because it's constant debate. The data minimization is often considered the gold standard, but it's often the most difficult to actually make happen and get passed. So what do you think?
Yeah, we certainly recommend data minimization as a strong principle. On the utility surveillance in particular, one thing that we have run into is that there are actually quite a number of protections on usage data. So I think that's the scariest thing that people think of when it comes to utility surveillance, which is just like how much, how much are you using, when are you using it, like that kind of more specific, like when are you turning on the lights situation. That is more often regulated by state laws, but a lot of times states just don't realize that the actual consumer personal information is what's really valuable to law enforcement. So we see like usage data being regulated, but all the information about the person, like their name or their address or their other identifying factors, that gets lost. So I would say when you're regulating information, make sure to do a comprehensive job and know what's actually of interest to law enforcement.
Really helpful. So next question's for David, which is basically, what can organizations that work with foster youth, caregivers, and advocates do to bring awareness to these surveillance issues with respect to child welfare systems and start these conversations and make sure people are informed about all this?
Well, in the last few years, there have really been various organizations that are solely dedicated to this issue, coming at it from different angles, whether it's grassroots mobilizing and activism, organizations like the Parent Legislative Action Network Plan, or JMAC for Families, Just Making a Change for Families, or organizations who are thinking on more sort of a policy level or sort of a movement. MFP is Movement for Family Power. Of course, now the Family Justice Law Center. If you're interested in getting involved, again, another shameless plug, fjlc.org. If you sign up, happy to continue the conversation and direct you to some conversations that are already ongoing, and would love to have any perspective you may have or your collective thoughts and movement.
Very helpful, thank you. So the next question is, does anybody have an opinion on the federal bill, the ADPPA, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act? STOP, I think, has not taken a position on it specifically, but I'm interested if, any of your organizations have thought about or taken a position on it.
This is not my area. I'm not one of, I don't work on the legislative side. It is a complex piece of legislation, and it has its strengths and its weaknesses. The opinion of many inside the ACLU is that it would be a net positive if it were to pass. But it's not a universal opinion.
Yeah, I think from what I've heard, it's an extremely strong piece of legislation in terms of what it would require. The issue is that it preempts state regulation on a lot of these privacy issues, and the enforcement is left to the US Attorney General, which means that if an administration is not friendly towards enforcing something, there's a risk that the law just won't be enforced, whereas if states have their own rules, each state's Attorney General could engage in enforcement. And so that's sort of, I think, the pushback. But the substance of the bill, I think, from most of what I've heard, people really like and think it does engage in, for example, strong data minimization requirements. But because of those two things, STOP hasn't taken a position. So that's what I can say on it off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone has anything to add. If not, we can go to the next question. The next question is about, does anyone want to talk a little bit about police partnerships with Amazon Ring, how those work, and how people might respond to their own neighbors if they see a Ring camera go up in their own neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of hand-in-glove relationship between two very powerful institutions in American life, law enforcement and Amazon, has been a very spooky thing, and it's been a big part of the issues that people have with Ring cameras. And reporting has revealed that Ring has worked very closely with offering standard contracts to local law enforcement that, for example, give Ring veto power over public statements that police make to the communities they serve about the technology they're using, that enroll police departments as sort of salespeople. See reports of police departments offering free Ring cameras in exchange for promises of access to footage, and so forth. And given that video surveillance is such a sensitive technology that has serious implications for our privacy and the relationship between the individual and their government, it's unseemly for our law enforcement agencies to be working so closely with a company to push surveillance into our communities and to change the nature of communities. we are, in addition to a privacy organization, we are a photographers' rights First Amendment organization, and we have defended photographers all over the country for taking, videos of police making arrests and so forth. And I think people have a right to photograph their front stoop. I would refer to what I said earlier about be careful about trying to empower yourself because you might be empowering others. But also, as an ethical matter, I think that it's just very uncool to point a camera at one of your neighbors, front doors and record the comings and goings of their. If you want to record your own comings and goings and take the risk that hackers might access or what have you, fine. But to record other people's, I think, as an ethical matter is not a good idea. And I think that I don't know what the legalities of that would turn out to be, and probably it's unclear and probably hasn't. If the poll camera cases that I talked about haven't been, maybe once they're resolved, it'll be clearer. If you have any kind of, I guess you could try suing their privacy torts, but that's not my area. But you could certainly go have a conversation with your neighbor and say, look, it's just not cool to be pointing a camera at my house.
Anyone have anything to add on that one? And the last question is tips to protect yourself from law enforcement hacking your technology through internet or Wi-Fi. And I'll just say, that's not the top of my concern list, just because all this stuff we're talking about is ways law enforcement can get access to so much information without having to hack anything at all. There's the holes that have been punched in the Fourth Amendment have been enormous with the third-party doctrine, and now with these giant data brokers, if the Fourth Amendment does apply to some data, law enforcement can just go around the Fourth Amendment and buy it, and that's what Nina's been dealing with a lot, I think, with respect to utility data. Hacking may be a real thing, it may be a real concern, but so much data is out there that just doesn't even need to be hacked with the amount of the devices we're putting inside of our homes, outside of our homes, that police are putting outside of our homes, with the amount of things that are available for sale. I don't know if other people have any thoughts on this particular issue.
Assume every device with a microphone or a camera in your house could be hacked, and think carefully about what those microphones and cameras are capturing. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff in the world about good cybersecurity practices, such as updating your technology so that if there are known vulnerabilities, that those can be fixed. One of the problems with Internet of Things devices is they often aren't updated ever. You might buy a device and the company's got a business, and there's every 13-year-old on the internet knows how to hack into it. It's sitting in your living room, and there's no company to release a patch, or it's difficult to release a patch because it's not necessarily the interface is difficult because it's an object of some kind. So hackers and law enforcement both can hack into your, not just law enforcement, but also random hackers.
And hackers can hack law enforcement. So if law enforcement gets a giant database of information, or if anyone gets this giant database of information, it can be hacked. And I think that, Nina, you were talking a little bit about Equifax. These databases, as they're being collected, are certainly vulnerable to hackers. Nina, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
I think you're absolutely right that once you have this tradition of amassing all this information, it's sitting with private companies that you have no idea about, and you have no idea what their security practices are. You don't know who they're selling it to. So I think that because so much of the surveillance relationship is now exported to private companies, one, it's so hard to even know who they are, and two, obviously we don't know how they're handling the data. And there's a question of, do you really want to trust Equifax to hold this massive database of your information given their history? So yeah, it's a concern for, like you said, not just law enforcement hacking, but anyone to hack that data.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're at time at 7 p.m. We appreciate everyone being here. Does anyone have any last words before we conclude? No? Well, then I just want to say a major thank you to all of our panelists, Jay Stanley, Nina Wang, and David Shalleck-Klein, who were just so invaluable. We're so grateful to have you sharing your experiences and your expertise. Thank you to everyone who attended live and watching the recording. We hope this is helpful to you. And just very grateful to everybody. And I think everyone here has brought up some policy solutions. And if you take with you that there are things that can be done and hassle your legislators about them, hopefully we can move in a better direction. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Jay, Nina. Thank you.